The crack in the pavement was my fault. I know that now. Not the crack itself. That was a product of a harsh winter and the slow, inexorable heave of the earth beneath. But the fact that I hadn't fixed it, that was on me. It was on my list, a list that was perpetually a mile long, scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt and stuck to the fridge with a ladybug magnet Lily had made in kindergarten. Fix pavement crack was nestled somewhere between buy more blue paint for the sky in Mr. Henderson's mural, and finally learn how to bake sourdough bread. For 3 years, this little house had been our sanctuary. After the divorce, after the cramped apartment that always smelled faintly of other people's cooking, this place was our promised land. It was small, a post-war bungalow with bones that groaned in the wind, but it was ours. I had poured every spare dollar and every ounce of my energy into it. I'd painted the shutters a cheerful robin's egg blue, planted a garden that exploded with defiant color in the summer, and installed a tire swing on the old oak tree in the backyard. It was a home built on a graphic designer's modest salary and a mountain of stubborn pride. Lily, my 7-year-old daughter, was the heart of this home. She was a whirlwind of scraped knees, paint-stained fingers, and a laugh that could chase the shadows out of any room. Her joy was the fuel that kept me going, the reason I spent my nights hunched over my computer, designing logos and websites for clients who paid just enough to keep our dream afloat. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people waved to each other on their morning walks and brought over casseroles when someone was sick. Or so I thought. On our left lived the Hendersons. To call them a couple was an understatement. They were a unit, a matched set of perfectly curated suburbanites. Richard Henderson was a partner at a downtown law firm, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite and a voice that was permanently set to condescending. His wife, Carol, was a walking, talking advertisement for the benefits of yoga and a gluten-free diet. She was the queen bee of the neighborhood association, the self-appointed guardian of property values and aesthetic conformity. Their house was a testament to their philosophy. It was a sprawling, modern colonial, all sharp angles and gleaming windows. Their lawn was a carpet of emerald green, so perfect it looked like it had been installed by a team of surgeons. Not a single blade of grass dared to grow out of place. They were the embodiment of the order I was striving for, the effortless perfection that always seemed just out of my grasp. From the beginning, I was a disruption. My little blue house was an affront to their beige and white world. My wildflower garden was a chaotic mess compared to their manicured rose bushes. My beat-up station wagon was a blemish on their street of gleaming SUVs. They never said anything, of course. They were too polite for that. But their disapproval was a palpable thing, a cold front that rolled in whenever I was in their presence. It was in the tight, thin line of Carol's lips when she saw Lily making mud pies in the backyard. It was in the way Richard's eyes would flick over to my slightly too long grass when he was getting his mail. I tried to bridge the gap. I brought over a plate of my famous chocolate chip cookies when we first moved in. Carol had accepted them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I later saw them in the trash when I was taking out my own garbage. I waved to them every time I saw them. Sometimes they would wave back, a flick of the wrist that was more of a dismissal than a greeting. The incident, when it happened, was so mundane, so utterly ordinary, that I almost didn't register it at first. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day that felt like a gift after a long, gray winter. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming lilacs, and the sun was warm on my face. Lily was in the front yard, her face a mask of fierce concentration as she pedaled her new bike, a birthday present from her grandparents. It was a beautiful machine, bright pink with sparkly tassels on the handlebars. She was still a little wobbly on it, but her confidence was growing with every successful lap around the driveway. I was on the porch, a half-finished logo design on my laptop, a lukewarm cup of coffee by my side. I was watching her, my heart swelling with that fierce, protective love that only a parent can know. She was so full of life, so fearless. "Look, Mommy, no hands," she shouted, her voice full of triumph. My heart did a little flip-flop of anxiety. "Okay, sweetie, but be careful," I called back, my voice a mixture of pride and apprehension. She wobbled for a moment, her handlebars twitching. Then her front wheel hit the crack in the pavement. The one I hadn't fixed yet. The bike stopped dead, but Lily didn't. She flew over the handlebars in a flurry of pink and denim, landing with a soft thud on the grass. For a moment there was silence, then a wail. I was by her side in a second, my laptop forgotten on the porch. "Lily, are you okay, baby?" She was more scared than hurt. Her knee was scraped and bleeding, a bright red gash against her pale skin. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt. I scooped her up in my arms, her small body trembling against mine. "It's okay, sweetie, it's okay. Mommy's got you," I murmured, rocking her gently. "Let's go inside and get you cleaned up." As I carried her toward the house, I happened to glance over at the Hendersons' place. And there they were, standing in their large picture window, two silent, judgmental figures. Richard was on the phone, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Carol was just staring, her arms crossed over her chest. There was no concern in their eyes, no sympathy, just a cold, calculating look that sent a shiver down my spine. At the time, I dismissed it as my own paranoia, my own insecurity about their silent judgment. I was too focused on Lily, on cleaning her wound and calming her fears. I put a cartoon-themed bandage on her knee, gave her a popsicle, and settled her on the couch with her favorite movie. The crisis was averted. The tears were dried. The world was right again. I had no idea that the crack in the pavement was about to become a chasm, a gaping maw that would swallow my life whole. I had no idea that the Hendersons weren't just watching. They were acting, and the consequences of their actions were about to come knocking on my door. The sound would be quiet at first, just a polite rap of knuckles on wood, but it would be the sound of my world breaking apart, and it was a sound I would never forget. It was 2 days later, a Tuesday. I remember the light was a soft, hazy gray, the kind that filters through a thin layer of clouds and makes the world feel muted. I was in the kitchen, trying to salvage a freelance project that was going off the rails. The client, a startup that sold artisanal dog food, wanted a logo that was both modern and rustic, but also playful. It was the kind of vague, contradictory feedback that made me want to tear my hair out. Lily was at school, the house was quiet, and I was mainlining coffee, trying to find a font that screamed organic, yet sophisticated for your discerning canine. Then came the knock. It wasn't a friendly knock, not the quick, cheerful rap of a neighbor or the rhythmic thud of a delivery driver. It was a formal, deliberate sound, 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the house. I felt a prickle of unease, a strange, unfounded sense of dread. I pushed my chair back, my half-designed logo forgotten on the screen, and walked to the door. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. She was in her late 40s, with a severe haircut and a pantsuit the color of wet cement. She held a leather-bound portfolio against her chest like a shield. I opened the door a few inches, leaving the chain on. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice more cautious than I intended. "Are you Sarah Jensen?" she asked, her voice as colorless as her suit. "Yes," I said, my hand tightening on the edge of the door. She held up a badge. "My name is Ms. Albright. I'm with the Department of Child and Family Services. May I come in?" The words didn't compute at first. They were a foreign language, a jumble of syllables that had no meaning in my world. Child and Family Services? It was a place for other people, for the desperate and the dangerous. Not for me. Not for my little blue house and my wildflower garden. I don't understand," I stammered, my mind racing. "Is there a problem?" "We've received a report," she said, her eyes flicking past me, scanning the sliver of my living room she could see. "An anonymous report alleging child neglect. I'm here to investigate." Anonymous. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. But I knew. In that instant, I knew. I saw the Hendersons in their picture window, Richard on the phone, Carol's cold, triumphant stare. This was their doing. This was their weapon. My first instinct was to slam the door in her face, to scream at her that she had the wrong house, the wrong life. But a cold, terrifying thought stopped me. If I refused, it would look like I had something to hide. And I had nothing to hide. This was all a ridiculous, malicious mistake. I fumbled with the chain, my fingers suddenly clumsy and slick with sweat. "Of course," I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. Please come in." Ms. Albright stepped inside, her presence immediately sucking the warmth out of the room. She moved with a slow, deliberate precision, her eyes missing nothing. She took in the pile of Lily's toys in the corner, the stack of mail on the entryway table, the half-empty coffee mug on the coaster. I felt a desperate urge to apologize for the mess, to explain that I was a working single mother, that my house wasn't always perfectly tidy. But I bit my tongue. I would not be made to feel like a suspect in my own home. "Let's sit down, shall we?" she said, gesturing toward the living room couch. It wasn't a request. We sat, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken accusations. I perched on the edge of my armchair, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. She opened her portfolio and took out a pen and a notepad. "So, Ms. Jensen," she began, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "tell me about your daughter." The question was so broad, so impossibly vast, that I didn't know how to answer. Tell you about Lily. How could I possibly distill my daughter, my vibrant, laughing, fearless Lily, into a few neat sentences for this cold, gray woman? "Her name is Lily," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "She's 7. She's in the 2nd grade. She loves to draw and she's learning to ride her bike." "Ah, yes, the bike," Ms. Albright said, her pen poised over the notepad. "The report mentioned an incident with a bicycle." "She fell," I said quickly, my voice rising in defense. "It was a minor accident. She scraped her knee. I was right there with her. I took care of her immediately." "The report suggests a pattern of neglect," she continued, her eyes fixed on me. "That your home is unsafe, that your daughter is often left unsupervised." "That's a lie," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "A malicious lie. My daughter is the most important thing in the world to me. I would never, ever do anything to harm her." She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea who might have made this report, Ms. Jensen?" I hesitated. If I accused the Hendersons, would it make me look paranoid? Vengeful? I had no proof, only a gut feeling and the memory of their cold stares. I can't imagine," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. The interview went on for what felt like an eternity. She asked about my work, my finances, my social life. She asked about Lily's father, about our custody arrangement. Each question was a subtle insinuation, a carefully placed barb designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like I was failing. Then she asked to see the rest of the house. I led her on a tour of my life, my home stripped bare for her inspection. She opened my refrigerator, her eyes scanning the contents as if looking for evidence of malnutrition. She peered into my medicine cabinet, her gaze lingering on a bottle of prescription anxiety medication from the darkest days of my divorce. She walked into Lily's room, her sterile presence a violation of that sacred, colorful space. When she was finally done, she stood by the front door, her portfolio tucked back under her arm. "I'll need to speak with Lily," she said. "At her school without you present. I'll also be speaking with her teachers, your pediatrician, and your neighbors." The thought of this woman, this cold, calculating stranger, talking to my daughter alone, filled me with a primal terror. "You can't," I said, my voice pleading. "She's just a child, you'll scare her." "It's standard procedure, Ms. Jensen," she said, her voice softening for the first time, a calculated, patronizing gesture. "The investigation has to be thorough, for Lily's sake." And then she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was left standing in the silence of my violated home. I leaned against the door, my legs trembling so violently I could barely stand. The air was thick with the ghost of her perfume, a cloying, artificial scent that seemed to cling to everything. I slid down to the floor, my body racked with silent, heaving sobs. The fear was a physical thing, a cold, heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. My home, my sanctuary, had been breached. My life, my carefully constructed world, was no longer my own. It was in the hands of a stranger, a woman who held the power to take my daughter away from me. The Hendersons had done this. They had taken their petty, suburban spite and forged it into a weapon. And they had aimed it at the one thing I could not bear to lose, my Lily. The fight for my daughter, for my life, had begun, and I had no idea how I was going to win. But as I sat there on the floor, the tears drying on my face, a new feeling began to smolder in the ashes of my fear. It was a tiny, flickering ember of rage. And I knew with a certainty that cut through the terror that I would not let them win. I would not let them destroy us. I would fight. For Lily. For our home. For the life we had built. I would fight, and I would not stop until I had taken back everything they had tried to steal from me. The war had begun, and I would not be the only casualty. The days that followed Ms. Albright's visit were a blur of muted terror. The world outside my windows went on as usual. The sun rose and set, the mail was delivered, people walked their dogs. But inside my little blue house, a suffocating fog had rolled in. I was living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every phone call made my heart leap into my throat. Every knock on the door sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear through me. The whispering campaign began almost immediately. It was subtle at first, a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts in the social fabric of the neighborhood. The friendly waves from across the street became hesitant, then stopped altogether. The casual chats at the mailbox were replaced with averted eyes and hurried retreats. I was no longer Sarah, the single mom with the cute little house. I was a question mark, a rumor, a potential threat. Carol Henderson was the conductor of this silent, vicious orchestra. I would see her talking to other neighbors, her head tilted in a gesture of feigned concern, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see their effect in the way people looked at me afterwards. Their faces were a mixture of pity, suspicion, and a kind of morbid curiosity. I was the neighborhood's new soap opera, a real-life drama playing out for their entertainment. The isolation was a physical thing, a wall of silence that surrounded me wherever I went. At the grocery store, people would steer their carts away from my aisle. At the park, mothers would call their children away from the swings when Lily and I arrived. Lily, in her innocent, 7-year-old world, didn't seem to notice. But I did. Every sideways glance, every whispered comment, was a fresh stab of a knife that was already buried deep in my heart. My work, my one remaining connection to the person I used to be, began to suffer. I would stare at my computer screen for hours, the vibrant colors and clean lines of my design software mocking my own chaotic, fractured state of mind. The client who wanted the modern, rustic, playful logo for their dog food sent me a terse email, firing me for missing a deadline. I couldn't even bring myself to care. The world of logos and branding seemed frivolous, a relic from a life that was no longer mine. The nights were the worst. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. I would lie in bed, my body rigid with anxiety, my mind a relentless carousel of worst-case scenarios. I would see Ms. Albright's cold, judgmental face, hear her sterile, accusing questions. I would imagine her talking to Lily, twisting her innocent words into something ugly and incriminating. I would picture strangers coming to my door, taking my daughter away from me, her small hand slipping from my grasp. I would wake up gasping for air, my pillow damp with sweat and tears. The house itself, my sanctuary, began to feel like a prison. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, the silence amplifying my fears. I started to second-guess everything. Was the house clean enough? Was there enough healthy food in the fridge? Was I spending enough quality time with Lily? The Hendersons' poison had seeped into my bloodstream, making me see my own life through their distorted, critical lens. The interview with Lily's teacher was a new circle of hell. Mrs. Davison was a kind, grandmotherly woman who had always been one of Lily's biggest cheerleaders. But when I went to pick Lily up from school a few days after Ms. Albright's visit, her usual warm smile was replaced with a look of strained politeness. "Can we have a word, Ms. Jensen?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. We stood in the hallway, the scent of chalk dust and disinfectant hanging in the air. She told me that Ms. Albright had been there, that she had asked a lot of questions. About Lily's behavior, her academic progress, her home life. I told her that Lily is a wonderful, bright little girl, Mrs. Davison said, her eyes not quite meeting mine. But she seemed very concerned. The unspoken words hung in the air between us. Concerned about what? About the scraped knee? About the fact that I was a single mother? About the fact that I didn't have a trust fund and a house the size of a small hotel? "Did she say what this was about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Davison hesitated. She mentioned an anonymous tip, something about an unstable home environment. Unstable. The word was a slap in the face. I had built my entire life around creating a stable, loving home for my daughter. And now, because of the Hendersons' malice, I was being painted as the opposite. The final, crushing blow came a week later. It was a letter, on official letterhead from the Department of Child and Family Services. It informed me that, pending the outcome of the investigation, I was required to attend mandatory parenting classes. And it continued, a formal home study would be conducted. Someone would be coming to my house once a week to observe my interactions with Lily. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring together through a fresh wave of tears. This was no longer just an investigation. It was an invasion. A systematic dismantling of my life, my privacy, my confidence as a mother. I was standing in the kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't think I could bear to hear another voice of judgment, another carefully worded expression of concern. But something made me pick it up. "Sarah, it's Chloe. You sound terrible. What's wrong?" Chloe, my best friend since college. A paralegal with a mind like a steel trap and a heart of pure gold. I hadn't told her yet. I hadn't told anyone. The shame was too great, the fear too paralyzing. But hearing her voice, her warm, no-nonsense tone, the dam inside me finally broke. The words came pouring out, a torrent of fear and rage and despair. I told her everything. The knock on the door, Ms. Albright, the whispers, the letter. When I was done, there was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, Chloe's voice, no longer warm but cold and hard as steel. "They did what?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Those two-faced, soulless, picket fence painting monsters, they actually did it." "I don't know what to do, Chloe," I sobbed, the fight finally draining out of me. "They're going to take her away from me. I know they are." "No, they are not," Chloe said, her voice ringing with a certainty that I hadn't felt in weeks. "You listen to me, Sarah. You are a good mother. You are a damn good mother. And we are not going to let these people or anyone else tear your life apart. You hear me?" "But the investigation," I started. "Forget the investigation," she cut me off. "We're not playing defense anymore. We're going on offense. I'm coming over, and you're going to call your dad. We need him." My dad, Frank, a retired police detective with a cynical view of the world and an unshakable love for his daughter and granddaughter. I hadn't called him for the same reason I hadn't called Chloe. I didn't want to disappoint him. I didn't want him to see me as a failure. But Chloe was right. I couldn't do this alone. The whispering campaign had isolated me, had made me feel like I was on a tiny, sinking island. But I wasn't alone. I had my people. And they were not the kind of people who backed down from a fight. I hung up the phone with Chloe, my hand still trembling, but for a different reason now. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else. Something that felt a lot like hope. I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes, and picked up the phone again. I dialed my father's number. The Hendersons had started a war. They thought they were fighting a weak, defenseless woman. They were about to find out how wrong they were. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea about the storm that was about to break over their perfectly manicured lawn, and I was going to be the one to unleash it. The whispers were about to be drowned out by the thunder, and I would not be silenced again. An hour later, my small living room had become a war room. The air, which had been thick with despair, was now charged with a different kind of energy. It was the energy of righteous fury, of strategic planning, of a family circling the wagons. Chloe arrived first, a whirlwind of righteous indignation and practical efficiency. She swept into the house, her arms full of files and a laptop, her eyes blazing. She didn't hug me, not at first. Instead, she took the crumpled letter from my hand, smoothed it out on the coffee table, and read it with a lawyer's dispassionate intensity. "Okay," she said, her voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the fire in her eyes. "Parenting classes, home study. This is standard procedure when they're building a case. They're trying to document a pattern to create a paper trail that justifies their interference." "But there is no pattern," I said, my voice cracking. "I know that," she said, finally looking at me, her gaze softening. And you know that. But right now, the only thing that matters is what Ms. Albright and her anonymous sources say. So we're going to build our own paper trail, a better one. My father, Frank, arrived a few minutes later. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity in his 30 years as a detective, and it had left its mark on him. He was quiet, observant, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of granite and left out in the rain. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, a man who never wasted a word or a step. He didn't say much at first. He just listened, his eyes fixed on my face as I recounted the story for a second time. He walked around the living room, his old detective's instincts kicking in. He looked out the window at the Hendersons' house, his expression unreadable. When I was done, he sat down in my armchair, the one Ms. Albright had sat in, and let out a long, slow breath. "The Hendersons," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Richard and Carol lived here about 10 years. He's a partner at a big firm downtown. She's on the board of everything. The neighborhood's self-appointed royalty." I stared at him. "You know them." "I know of them," he corrected. "In my line of work, you learn to keep tabs on people, especially the ones who think they're above it all. They're pillars of the community. The kind of people who donate to the policeman's ball and then complain about the color of their neighbor's mailbox." He looked from me to Chloe, his gaze sharp and focused. "This isn't about a scraped knee. This is about control. They don't like you, Sarah. You're not part of their club. You're a single mom, an artist, you've got a beat-up car and a wildflower garden. You're a weed in their perfect lawn. And they're trying to pull you out by the roots." Hearing my own fears articulated so clearly, so bluntly, was both terrifying and validating. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't crazy. This was real. "So what do?" I asked, my voice small. "We fight," Chloe said, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. "First things first, we need a lawyer, a good one. Someone who specializes in this kind of thing. I've got a few names, people who owe me favors." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I can't afford a lawyer, not a good one." "You can't afford not to have one," Chloe countered. "This isn't a traffic ticket, Sarah. This is your life. We'll figure out the money. We'll sell my shoe collection if we have to." My father held up a hand, silencing her. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said. "A lawyer is a bazooka. Right now, we need a scalpel. We need information. We need to know exactly what they said, who they said it to, and what proof they have. Or more likely, what proof they don't have." He turned to me. "The parenting classes. You're going to go. You're going to be the best damn student they've ever had. You're going to take notes. You're going to ask questions. You're going to be a model of maternal perfection. You're going to give them nothing to use against you." He then turned to Chloe. "The home study. You're going to be here for every single one. You're a paralegal. You know the rules. You're going to be a silent observer, a witness. You're going to make sure they don't cross any lines, don't twist any words." And then he looked at me again, a flicker of the old, street-smart detective in his eyes. "And I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to dig. I'm going to find out everything there is to know about Richard and Carol Henderson. I'm going to talk to their old neighbors, their former employees, anyone who might have a story to tell. People like that, they leave a trail of bodies behind them. Metaphorically speaking, of course." For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile touched my lips. Of course. The plan was set. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But it was no longer the only thing I felt. It was now mixed with a new, unfamiliar emotion. It was the feeling of being on the offensive, of having a strategy, of having a team. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I went to the parenting classes, held in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room in the basement of a community center. I sat among a group of truly struggling parents, people whose lives were a chaotic mess of poverty and addiction and desperation. I felt like an imposter, a fraud. But I did what my father told me to do. I took notes. I participated in the discussions. I was a model student. The home studies were even worse. A new social worker, a young man with earnest, sympathetic eyes, would come to the house once a week. He would sit on my couch and watch me and Lily play, his pen scratching away on his notepad. Chloe would sit in the corner, a silent, formidable presence, her laptop open, her eyes missing nothing. I felt like an animal in a zoo, my every interaction with my own child being observed, judged, documented. But through it all, I held on to the knowledge that we were fighting back. My father would call me every few days, his voice low and conspiratorial. He was making progress. He'd found a former housekeeper who had been fired for breaking a vase. He'd talked to a contractor who had been stiffed on a bill. He was painting a picture of the Hendersons, a portrait that was very different from the one they presented to the world. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, trying to force myself to eat, when my father called. "I think I've got something," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "Something big." He had tracked down a family who had lived in my house before me, a young couple with 2 small children. They had been forced to move after a series of anonymous complaints to the city. Complaints about their barking dog, about the color of their front door, about a child's birthday party that was apparently too loud. They were a nice family, my father said, but they were renters. They didn't have the money or the will to fight, so they left. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The complaints were all anonymous, but the city keeps records. I pulled a few strings, called in a few favors. I found out who made the calls. I held my breath. Who was it? "It was a woman," he said, his voice grim. "A woman who lived next door, a woman named Carol Henderson." I sank into a chair, the phone pressed hard against my ear. This was it. This was the proof. This was the crack in their perfect, pristine facade. It wasn't just about me. It was a pattern of harassment, of intimidation, of using their power and influence to bully anyone who didn't fit into their perfect little world. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of relief and rage. "Now," my father said, his voice as cold and hard as a jailhouse door. "Now we get a lawyer. Now we go to war." The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by something else, a cold, clear, righteous anger. The Hendersons had picked a fight with the wrong family. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated my friends. They had underestimated my father, and they were about to pay the price. The whispers were about to end, and the reckoning was about to begin. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, and I was ready to fight for my daughter, for my home, for my life. And for every other family the Hendersons had tried to break. The tide was turning, and I was the storm. The discovery of the Hendersons' past transgressions was like a shot of adrenaline to my weary soul. The fog of fear and helplessness that had enveloped me for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by the sharp, clear light of purpose. We had them. We had a pattern. We had proof of their malice. This was no longer a case of their word against mine. It was a case of their documented history of harassment against my truth. Chloe, my paralegal best friend, was ecstatic. "This is it, Sarah," she said, her voice buzzing with energy as we sat in my living room, my father's notes spread out on the coffee table. "This is the smoking gun. A malicious prosecution case is incredibly hard to prove. You have to show that the defendant initiated a legal action with malice and without probable cause, and that the action was terminated in your favor. The fact that they have a history of this kind of behavior is a game changer." The lawyer Chloe found for us was a young, hungry attorney named Ben Carter. He had only been out of law school for 5 years, but he had a reputation for being a bulldog, a tenacious litigator who loved taking on Goliaths. When we met him in his small, cluttered office, he listened to our story with an intensity that was both unnerving and reassuring. He didn't interrupt, he just let me talk, his eyes never leaving my face. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "I love this case," he said, his voice a low, confident drawl. "I absolutely love it. The Hendersons, I know who they are. They're everything that's wrong with the world. They're bullies who hide behind their money and their social standing, and we're going to take them down." The first step was to deal with the CPS case. Ben drafted a letter to Ms. Albright and her superiors, a masterpiece of legal prose that was both polite and menacing. It laid out the evidence of the Hendersons' harassment campaign, including a sworn affidavit from the family they had driven out of my house. It pointed out the procedural errors in the investigation that Chloe had meticulously documented. and it strongly suggested that if the case against me was not immediately dismissed, we would be filing a lawsuit against the department for their role in this malicious prosecution. The effect was immediate. 2 days later, I received a call from Ms. Albright's supervisor. His voice was a stark contrast to Albright's cold, sterile tone. He was apologetic, conciliatory. He informed me that after a review of the case, they were dropping the investigation. All findings would be expunged from my record. The mandatory parenting classes and home studies were terminated, effective immediately. I hung up the phone, my body trembling with relief. It was over. The first battle was won. I was no longer a suspect. I was no longer under their microscope. I was free. But our war was far from over. Now, it was our turn to go on the offensive. Ben filed the lawsuit against the Hendersons the next day. The charges were simple and brutal: defamation, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We weren't just asking for damages. We were asking for a jury to send a message, to punish the Hendersons for their arrogance and their cruelty. The Hendersons, as expected, were dismissive. They hired a team of high-priced lawyers from Richard's own firm. They filed a motion to dismiss, calling our lawsuit frivolous and baseless. They were so insulated by their wealth and their privilege that they couldn't imagine that a single mother and her upstart young lawyer could possibly pose a threat to them. They were wrong. The depositions were the first time I had seen the Hendersons up close since this nightmare began. They walked into the conference room of Ben's office like they owned the place, their faces masks of bored indifference. Carol was dressed in a crisp white linen suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun. Richard was in a tailored pinstripe suit, his jaw set in a permanent sneer. I was terrified. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs. But then I looked at Ben, and he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. And I looked at Chloe, who was sitting beside me, her expression a mask of calm, professional focus. And I thought of my father, who was out there, still digging, still finding more cracks in the Hendersons' perfect facade. I took a deep breath and met their gaze. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like their equal. Ben was a master in that deposition room. He was polite, almost deferential at first, lulling them into a false sense of security. He started with Carol. He asked her about her role in the neighborhood association, about her commitment to maintaining property values. She preened under his questions, her answers full of self-congratulatory platitudes. Then he pounced. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and precise. "Do you know a family by the name of Martinez?" Carol's smile faltered. I don't recall." "Let me refresh your memory," Ben said, sliding a document across the table. "This is a sworn affidavit from Mr. and Mrs. Martinez. They used to live at your neighbor's address. They state that they were forced to move after a series of anonymous complaints to the city about everything from their dog to their barbecue smoke. Do you know anything about that?" Carol's face paled. I may have made a call or two. It was a matter of upholding neighborhood standards." "And is it also a matter of neighborhood standards to make anonymous calls to child and family services?" Ben asked, his voice like the crack of a whip. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a high, thin whine. "Really?" Ben said, sliding another document across the table. "This is a copy of the anonymous tip that was made against my client, and these are the phone records from your home, showing a call to the CPS hotline at the exact time the tip was made." Carol stared at the documents, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with panic. Richard put a hand on her arm, his face a thundercloud of rage. "This is an outrage," he boomed, his voice echoing in the small room. "My wife is a pillar of this community. You are harassing her." "I'm just asking questions, Mr. Henderson," Ben said, his voice calm and steady. "And now I have a few for you." He turned his attention to Richard, and the onslaught continued. He questioned him about his finances, about his business dealings, about a series of lawsuits that had been filed against his firm for unethical practices. With every question, another crack appeared in their armor. By the end of the day, they were no longer the picture of suburban perfection. They were two angry, cornered animals, their malice and their arrogance stripped bare for all to see. We left the deposition room that day feeling victorious. We had them on the ropes. We had them scared. The motion to dismiss was denied. The case was going to trial. The Hendersons' lawyers, sensing the shift in the tide, offered to settle. It was a generous offer, enough to cover my legal fees and then some. For a moment, I was tempted. I was so tired of fighting. I just wanted my life back. But then I thought about what they had done. I thought about the sleepless nights, the public humiliation, the terror of thinking I might lose my daughter. And I thought about the Martinez family, and who knows how many others the Hendersons had bullied into submission. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice. "No," I said to Ben, my voice clear and strong. "We're not settling. I want them in a courtroom. I want a jury to hear what they did. I want them to be held accountable, not just with their money, but with their reputation. I want everyone to know who they really are." Ben's smile was slow and satisfied. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. The stage was set. The battle lines were drawn. The Hendersons had tried to destroy my life with a whisper campaign. Now I was going to answer them with a roar. The courtroom was waiting, and I was ready. The armor they had built around themselves was cracking, and I was about to shatter it into a million pieces. The trial felt like the culmination of my entire life. Every struggle, every setback, every small victory had led me to this point, to this sterile, wood-paneled courtroom where my life would be laid bare for a jury of my peers to inspect. The air was thick with a tension that was almost suffocating. On one side of the aisle sat the Hendersons, flanked by their team of expensive lawyers. They looked smaller, somehow, stripped of the familiar backdrop of their perfect house and their manicured lawn. They looked like what they were: two angry, frightened people who were used to getting their own way, and who were now facing the consequences of their actions for the first time in their lives. On my side, I had my own small army. Ben, my lawyer, was a rock of calm confidence, his notes and files arranged in neat, orderly piles on the table in front of him. Chloe was in the front row of the gallery, her eyes fixed on me, a silent source of strength and support. My father was there too, his face a mask of grim determination. He had done his job. He had given us the ammunition we needed. Now it was up to me and Ben to fire the shots. My testimony was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. For 2 hours, Ben led me through the story of the past few months, his questions gentle but precise. I told the jury about my life before the Hendersons' call, about the small, happy world I had built for myself and my daughter. I told them about the knock on the door, about Ms. Albright's cold, accusing eyes, about the fear and the shame and the isolation. I told them about the whispers, the averted gazes, the feeling of being a pariah in my own neighborhood. The Hendersons' lawyer was brutal in his cross-examination. He tried to paint me as an unstable, over-emotional single mother, a woman who was looking for a quick payday. He twisted my words, he belittled my career, he even tried to use my prescription for anxiety medication against me. "So, you're an anxious person, Ms. Jensen?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're prone to overreacting." I looked at him, and then I looked at the jury, and I told them the truth. "I am," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I have struggled with anxiety, especially after a difficult divorce. But does that make me a bad mother? Does that mean I don't love my daughter? Or does it just mean that I'm human?" I could see the flicker of sympathy in the eyes of a few of the jurors. They were real people with real problems. They understood. The turning point in the trial came when Ben called Mr. Martinez to the stand. He was a quiet, unassuming man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He told the jury about his family, about how they had been so excited to move into the neighborhood, about how they had been driven out by a relentless campaign of anonymous complaints. "We just wanted to be left alone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But they wouldn't stop. It was like they were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. We felt like we were under siege in our own home." Then Ben presented the evidence my father had uncovered: the phone records, the city complaints, the undeniable proof that Carol Henderson was the one who had been terrorizing this family. The final nail in the Hendersons' coffin was a surprise witness. a woman named Sarah, who had been the Hendersons' housekeeper for 5 years. She was a small, nervous woman, but her voice was strong and clear as she told the jury about the conversation she had overheard the day after Lily's accident. "They were in the kitchen," she said, her eyes fixed on the Hendersons. "They were laughing. Mrs. Henderson said, 'That'll teach her to bring her trashy little life into our neighborhood.' And Mr. Henderson said, 'She'll be gone within a month. I'll make sure of it.'" A gasp went through the courtroom. The mask of civility finally slipped from the Hendersons' faces. Carol's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Richard looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Ben's closing argument was a masterpiece. He didn't shout. He didn't grandstand. He just laid out the facts, one by one, like a surgeon making a series of precise incisions. He painted a picture of two arrogant, malicious people who had used their power and their privilege to try and destroy a woman's life, simply because she didn't fit into their perfect, sterile world. "This isn't just about a scraped knee," he said, his voice ringing with quiet passion. "This is about the abuse of power. This is about the right of every person to live in peace, without fear of harassment or intimidation. This is about sending a message that says that we, as a community, will not tolerate this kind of behavior. We will not allow the wealthy and the powerful to bully the weak and the vulnerable into submission." The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The foreman was a middle-aged man with a kind, weary face. He cleared his throat, and the courtroom fell silent. "On the charge of defamation," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness, "we the jury find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jensen." A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. I gripped Chloe's hand, my eyes filling with tears. "On the charge of malicious prosecution," the foreman continued, "we find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jensen." "And on the charge of intentional infliction of emotional distress," he said, his voice rising, "we find for the plaintiff, Sarah Jensen." He then read the amount of the damages they were awarding. It was a staggering sum, far more than we had ever imagined. It was enough to cover my legal fees, to compensate me for my lost work and my emotional distress, and then some. It was enough to change my life. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the validation. It was about the fact that a jury of my peers had heard my story, had seen the truth, and had delivered a verdict that was not just a legal victory, but a moral one. The Hendersons sat there, stunned, their faces ashen. Their perfect world had come crashing down around them. They were no longer the kings and queens of their little suburban castle. They were just two bitter, defeated people who had been exposed for what they truly were. As we left the courtroom, a crowd of reporters surrounded us. For the first time, I didn't shy away from the cameras. I stood tall, with my head held high, and I answered their questions. "This was never about money," I said, my voice clear and strong. "This was about justice, and today justice was served." The legal battle was over. I had won. I had faced my tormentors, and I had defeated them. I had taken back my life, my reputation, my peace of mind. But the war was not quite over. There was one more battle to be fought, one more piece of the puzzle to be put into place. The Hendersons had tried to take my home from me. Now I was going to take theirs. The final act of this drama was about to begin, and it would be the most satisfying of all. The house that Spite had built was about to have a new owner, and I had the key. The judgment against the Hendersons was more than just a number on a piece of paper. It was a wrecking ball, and it swung with devastating force into the carefully constructed edifice of their lives. Their arrogance, their belief in their own invincibility, had been their undoing. They had refused to settle, convinced that their money and their influence would protect them. Now they were facing financial ruin. Their team of high-priced lawyers, who had been so confident and so condescending, were now scrambling to do damage control. They filed appeals, they tried to negotiate a smaller settlement, they did everything they could to protect their clients' assets. But it was too late. The judgment was ironclad. The Hendersons were legally obligated to pay. And they couldn't. The amount was simply too large. Their wealth, it turned out, was largely an illusion, a house of cards built on a foundation of debt and leveraged assets. They had the trappings of wealth, the expensive cars, the designer clothes, the sprawling house, but they didn't have the liquid cash to satisfy the judgment. So the court did what the court does in such situations. It began the process of seizing their assets. Their cars were repossessed. Their bank accounts were frozen. And their house, their beautiful, perfect, soulless house, the symbol of their supposed superiority, was put up for public auction. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The whispers started again, but this time they were not about me. They were about the Hendersons. The same people who had once looked at me with suspicion and pity were now looking at the Hendersons with a mixture of shock, awe, and a healthy dose of schadenfreude. The kings and queens of the neighborhood had been dethroned, and their subjects were enjoying the spectacle. I watched it all from a distance, a strange sense of detachment settling over me. I should have been gloating. I should have been savoring their downfall. But instead, I just felt a kind of weary sadness. They had brought this on themselves, of course. But their destruction was a hollow victory. It wouldn't erase the sleepless nights, the fear, the humiliation. It wouldn't give me back the time I had lost, the peace of mind they had stolen. But there was one more thing I had to do. One final act of poetic justice that I owed to myself, to my daughter, and to the family they had driven out of my house. The day of the auction was a bright, crisp autumn afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The leaves on the trees were a riot of red and gold. It was a perfect day for a new beginning. I arrived with Ben, my lawyer, by my side. The auction was being held on the front lawn of the Hendersons' house, the same lawn that Carol had so obsessively manicured. It was now trampled and scarred by the feet of 100 curious onlookers. The Hendersons were nowhere to be seen. They had already moved out, disappearing in the middle of the night like thieves. The crowd was a motley crew of real estate developers, bargain hunters, and nosy neighbors. They buzzed with excitement, their voices a low hum of speculation. I stood at the back of the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never done anything like this before. The amount of money I was about to spend was terrifying. It was the money from the settlement, the money that was supposed to be my security, my fresh start. But I knew, with a certainty that cut through the fear, that this was what I had to do. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, began the proceedings. The bidding started low, but quickly escalated. The developers were aggressive, their bids coming in fast and furious. I waited, my hand on Ben's arm, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. "Not yet," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. "Wait for it." The bidding climbed higher and higher, past the market value of the house, past the point where it was a good investment. It was now a battle of egos, of developers who didn't want to lose. Finally, the bidding began to slow. One of the developers dropped out, then another. It was down to two, a man in a cheap suit with a hungry look in his eyes, and a woman with a clipboard and a determined jaw. "Now," Ben said, his voice low and urgent. I raised my hand, my heart in my throat. "Yes," I said, my voice surprisingly clear and strong. The auctioneer's head swiveled in my direction. "We have a new bidder," he boomed, a grin spreading across his face. The man in the cheap suit looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise. The woman with the clipboard just scowled. The bidding war was on. They would raise the price, and I would raise it again. I was no longer thinking about the money. I was thinking about everything that had led me to this moment. I was thinking about the knock on the door, the whispers, the fear. I was thinking about my daughter and the life I wanted to build for her. Finally, it was down to me and the woman with the clipboard. She made a bid, and the auctioneer looked at me. "Do I hear another?" he asked, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. I took a deep breath, and I made my final bid. It was a number that was both absurd and perfect. It was the exact amount of the judgment the jury had awarded me. The woman with the clipboard stared at me, her mouth open. She shook her head and turned away. "Going once," the auctioneer called out. "Going twice." He looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Sold," he shouted, his gavel coming down with a resounding crack. "To the lady in the back." A wave of applause went through the crowd. I stood there, stunned, as Ben wrapped me in a hug. I had done it. It was mine. The house that Spite had built was now my own. A week later, Lily and I stood on the porch of our new home. It was strange, being inside this house that had been the source of so much of my fear and anger. It was bigger than our little blue house, grander, more imposing. But it was just a house, a collection of wood and glass and stone. It had no power over me anymore. We had a picnic on the front lawn that afternoon, on the same patch of grass where the auction had been held. We ate sandwiches and drank lemonade, and Lily did cartwheels on the perfect, emerald green grass. I looked over at our old house, the little blue bungalow that had been our sanctuary. It looked small and a little shabby from this new vantage point, but it was the house that had saved us. It was the house where we had found our strength, where we had learned to fight back. A new family was moving in next week, a young couple with a baby on the way. I had already met them. They were nice. They were normal. They were everything the Hendersons were not. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Lily came and sat beside me. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her small hand in mine. "I like this house, Mommy," she said, her voice sleepy. "It's a happy house." I smiled and pulled her close. "Yes, it is, sweetie," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's a very happy house." The Hendersons had tried to tear us down, to break us, to drive us out. But they had failed. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated my love for my daughter. And they had underestimated the power of a community to stand up to bullies. We had not just survived. We had triumphed. We had taken their weapon, their symbol of power and oppression, and we had made it our own. We had turned their house of spite into a home of love and laughter. And as I sat there with my daughter in my arms, watching the last rays of the sun disappear behind the horizon, I knew with a certainty that filled my soul that we were finally truly home. The war was over, and we had won.